The evening started like any other family dinner. The aroma of freshly cooked dal and rotis filled the small dining room as 70-year-old Kamala carefully carried the steaming tea tray to the table. Her weathered hands, once steady and strong, trembled slightly as she set down each cup with the love only a mother knows. "Careful, Ma," her son Arjun said absently, scrolling through his phone without looking up. Kamala smiled softly. Even at 50, he was still her little boy. She reached for his cup, wanting to add just a little more sugar the way he liked it, when her elbow accidentally brushed against the teapot. The hot liquid spilled across the wooden table, seeping into the tablecloth she had embroidered herself years ago. "Oh no," she whispered, quickly reaching for a cloth. "I'm so sorry, I'll clean it right away." But before she could move, her daughter-in-law Priya's sharp voice cut through the air like a knife. "Seriously? Again?" Priya slammed her phone down, her perfectly manicured nails clicking against the table. "This is the third time this week, Ma. First you forgot to turn off the gas, then you mixed up the salt and sugar, and now this mess. You're becoming completely useless." The word hung in the air like poison. Useless. Kamala's heart stopped for a moment. She looked around the table, at her grandson Rohan who kept his eyes glued to his homework, at her son who continued staring at his screen as if nothing had happened, at Priya whose cold eyes showed not an ounce of remorse. I was just trying to." Kamala's voice came out as barely a whisper. "Trying to what? Break something else?" Priya stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "Honestly, Arjun, we can't keep pretending this isn't a problem. She's becoming a burden on this family." Kamala waited. She waited for her son to defend her, to remind his wife that this was still his mother they were talking about. She waited for the boy she had raised with her own blood and sweat to show even the smallest sign that he cared. But Arjun just sighed heavily. "Priya, please. Not in front of Rohan. Not don't talk to my mother like that. Not she's not a burden. Just not in front of the child." Kamala felt something break inside her chest. Not her heart, she realized, but her hope. The hope she had been clinging to that her family still saw her as more than just an inconvenience taking up space in their home. "You know what? Fine." Priya grabbed her plate and stormed toward the kitchen. "Clean up your own mess, Ma. I'm tired of doing everything around here." The silence that followed was deafening. Kamala slowly bent down to pick up the fallen cloth, her knees aching with each movement. As she wiped the spilled tea, she noticed how the brown stain spread across the white tablecloth, just like the humiliation spreading through her soul. "Daddy, are you okay?" Little Rohan finally whispered. His innocent eyes filled with confusion. Kamala forced a smile, the same smile she had worn for years to hide her pain. "I'm fine, Beta. Just a little accident." But as she gathered the soiled cloth and walked to the kitchen, she knew she wasn't fine. She hadn't been fine for a very long time. That night, as the house settled into sleep, Kamala sat by her bedroom window staring at the stars. The word useless echoed in her mind like a cruel song. When had she become this person? When had the woman who once managed an entire household single-handedly become someone who couldn't even serve tea without causing problems? She looked at the framed photo on her nightstand, her late husband Mohan smiling back at her from what felt like another lifetime. "What would you say, G?" she whispered to his image. "What would you tell me to do?" But she already knew the answer. Mohan had always taught her that respect isn't given. It's earned. And somewhere along the way she had stopped earning it. She had become comfortable being comfortable, accepting whatever scraps of dignity her family threw her way. As the clock struck midnight, Kamala made a decision that would change everything. She wouldn't argue, she wouldn't fight, she wouldn't cause any more scenes. But she also wouldn't stay where her presence was seen as a problem to be solved, rather than a blessing to be cherished. The woman who had once moved mountains for her family was about to rediscover just how strong those mountains had made her. The next morning brought with it a flood of memories Kamala had tried so hard to bury. As she folded Arjun's shirts, a habit she couldn't seem to break even after all these years, her mind drifted back to when those hands were much smaller, much more dependent on her love. She was 28 when Mohan died, leaving her with a 6-year-old son and debts that seemed as endless as her tears. The neighbors had whispered their sympathies, but behind their kind words, she heard the real message. Poor woman, what will she do now? But Kamala had always been stronger than she looked. She remembered those early morning hours when the world was still asleep, sitting at her old Singer sewing machine that Mohan had bought her as a wedding gift. The rhythmic hum of the needle-piercing fabric became her lullaby, her meditation, her survival. Blouse after blouse, sari after sari. Each stitch was a small victory against the poverty that threatened to swallow them whole. "Mama, why do you work so much?" little Arjun would ask, rubbing his sleepy eyes as he found her still sewing at midnight. "Because dreams need fuel, Beta," she would tell him, pulling him onto her lap. "And your dreams are going to take you very far from here." She had been right about that, hadn't she? The boy who once struggled with simple addition was now an engineer, living in the very house her sacrifices had built. But somehow, in achieving everything she had dreamed for him, she had lost the son who used to curl up beside her, listening to stories of brave princes and kind mothers. Kamala walked to the old wooden trunk in the corner of her room, the same trunk she had carried from house to house during their struggling years. Inside, beneath layers of old saris and faded photographs, lay a small notebook. Her treasure diary, she used to call it. Page after page documented a mother's love in numbers. Saved 50 Indian rupees today by walking instead of taking the bus. Arjun's school fees. Sold my gold earrings, Indian rupee 200. For Arjun's engineering books. Worked extra hours at Mrs. Sharma's house, Indian rupee 300. For Arjun's coaching classes. Every entry told the same story. A woman who had made herself smaller so her child could grow larger. She flipped to the page dated 15 years ago, when Arjun had gotten his acceptance letter to study in Germany. The entire page was covered with her tears of joy, but she could still make out the words. "My son is going to be somebody. Every hungry night was worth it." The irony wasn't lost on her now. The same education she had sacrificed everything to provide had taken him so far from her that even when he sat across the dinner table, he felt like a stranger. "Ma, what are you doing?" Arjun's voice startled her from her thoughts. She quickly closed the notebook, but not before he caught a glimpse of the pages. "Just looking through old things." He sat down beside her on the bed, and for a moment, she saw the little boy who used to climb into this very bed after nightmares. "You kept all of this?" "A mother never throws away memories, Beta." Arjun picked up a faded photograph, the two of them at his engineering graduation. In the picture, Kamala stood proudly beside her son, wearing a simple cotton sari that she had saved months to buy. Her face glowed with a happiness so pure it seemed to light up the entire frame. "I remember this day," he said softly. "You cried through the entire ceremony." "Happy tears," she whispered. "I was so proud." "I know you were." His voice carried a weight she hadn't heard in years. "Ma, about last night. Priya was just stressed about work and—" "Don't," Kamala interrupted gently. "Don't make excuses for her, Beta. And don't make excuses for yourself." They sat in silence, the notebook between them holding decades of unspoken truths. Kamala wondered when they had stopped talking, really talking about anything that mattered. When had their conversations become limited to, "Did you eat? And how was work?" "Do you remember," she said quietly, "when you were 12, you told me you wanted to build me a palace when you grew up?" Arjun smiled sadly. "I remember. You said it would have the biggest kitchen in the world so I could cook for everyone I loved. And a garden where I could grow all my favorite flowers." She looked around the small room that had become her world. "You did build me something, Beta. But somewhere along the way, I became a guest in it instead of the queen you promised to make me." The words hung between them like a bridge, one that could either connect them or crumble under the weight of too much truth spoken too late. Arjun reached for her hand, and for a moment, she felt the little boy who used to hold her fingers when crossing the street. "Ma, Arjun." Priya's voice echoed from downstairs. "The clients are here. Where are you?" Just like that, the moment shattered. Arjun stood up, the distance between them expanding with each step toward the door. "We'll talk later, okay? I promise." But Kamala knew better than to believe in promises that came with conditions. As she heard his footsteps disappear down the stairs, she realized that the boy who had once promised her palaces had indeed kept his word. He had given her a beautiful home, financial security, and social respect. What he hadn't given her was a place in his heart that couldn't be overruled by a wife's convenience or a client's demands. And perhaps it was time she stopped waiting for him to remember that she was not just the woman who had raised him, but the woman who had raised herself in the process. The changes started small, like shadows creeping across a room as the sun sets. First, it was the locked cabinet in the kitchen where Kamala's special spices and her mother's silver had always been kept. The living room furniture was rearranged without asking her opinion, as if her 40 years of creating this home meant nothing. "It's more modern this way, Ma," Priya explained when Kamala mentioned the missing family photos from the mantelpiece. "These old pictures make the house look dated. Dated. As if the memories they held were expired goods to be discarded." Kamala tried to adapt, tried to find her place in this new version of her own home. She offered to help with the cooking, but Priya preferred ordering takeout. She suggested they plant flowers in the garden together, but Priya was too busy with her online shopping. Every gesture of love was met with polite dismissal. Every attempt at connection blocked by the invisible wall of modern indifference. The breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon that started like any other. Kamala was looking for her reading glasses when she decided to check the old study room, Mohan's sanctuary where he used to read newspapers and help young Arjun with homework. The room had been converted into Priya's home office months ago, but Kamala rarely entered it anymore. What she found there stopped her heart cold. In the corner, thrown carelessly into a cardboard box with old magazines and broken electronics, was Mohan's photograph, the large framed portrait that had sat on the study desk for 27 years. The glass was cracked, and dust had settled on his beloved face like a shroud. "No," she whispered, lifting the frame with trembling hands. "No, no, no. This wasn't just a photograph. This was the man who had loved her fearlessly, who had believed in her dreams, who had promised to grow old with her before fate decided otherwise. This was Arjun's father, the grandfather Rohan had never met, but whose stories had shaped the boy's understanding of courage and kindness. What are you doing in here?" Priya's sharp voice cut through Kamala's shock. "My husband's photo." Kamala turned around, holding the damaged frame against her chest. "Why is it in the trash?" Priya barely looked up from her laptop. "I was cleaning up. That old thing was collecting dust, and frankly, it's a bit depressing having a dead person staring at you while you work." The casual cruelty of those words hit Kamala like a physical blow. A dead person. As if Mohan had never laughed at this very desk, never helped their son with mathematics problems, never kissed her forehead before leaving for work each morning. "This is my husband." Kamala's voice grew stronger with each word. "This is Arjun's father. This is your family. Look, Ma, I understand you have sentimental attachments, but we need to move forward. This house can't be a shrine forever." Priya finally looked up, her expression devoid of any understanding. "Besides, Arjun and I have been talking about redecorating this room completely." "Talking?" Kamala felt something snap inside her chest. "About this house? Without asking me?" "With all due respect, Ma, Arjun is the one paying the mortgage now. We make the decisions about what happens here." There it was, the truth that had been hiding behind all the small cruelties and casual dismissals. In Priya's mind, Kamala wasn't the woman who had built this home brick by brick with her sweat and sacrifice. She was just an aging dependent whose opinions carried no weight in her own house. "Where is Arjun?" Kamala's voice was dangerously quiet. "He's in a meeting." "Ma, please don't make a scene about this. It's just a photo." But it wasn't just a photo, and when Arjun finally came home that evening, Kamala was waiting for him in the living room, Mohan's portrait beside her on the sofa. "Priya told me there was some confusion about Papa's picture," he said, loosening his tie with the exhausted air of a man who had already decided how this conversation would end. Confusion. Kamala looked at her son, really looked at him. When had his eyes become so distant? When had her little boy learned to speak in the cold language of convenience? "Your wife threw your father's photograph in the trash, Arjun." She called him a dead person. "Ma, she didn't mean." "Don't." Kamala stood up, and something in her posture made Arjun step back. "Don't you dare defend what cannot be defended. Don't you dare tell me what she meant when I heard what she said." For the first time in years, Arjun looked uncomfortable. "Look, maybe she could have been more sensitive about it, but Ma, we are trying to create our own space here. Surely you can understand that." "Your own space." Kamala repeated the words slowly, tasting their bitterness. In the house I cleaned for 30 years. In the home where I raised you alone after your father died. In the rooms where I went hungry so you could eat, where I cried silently so you could sleep peacefully. Ma, that's not fair. We've never asked you to leave. You're part of this family. Am I? She picked up Mohan's photograph, her fingers tracing the crack in the glass. Then why does your wife make financial decisions without consulting me? Why are my belongings moved and locked away without my permission? Why am I made to feel like a guest who has overstayed her welcome in my own home? The silence stretched between them, filled with years of unspoken resentments and unacknowledged truths. What do you want me to say, Ma? Arjun finally asked, and in that question Kamala heard her answer. He didn't want to choose. He didn't want to have difficult conversations or make hard decisions. He wanted her to be understanding, to be accommodating, to quietly accept whatever diminished version of dignity his wife was willing to grant her. I don't want you to say anything, Beta. Kamala walked toward the stairs, her back straight despite the weight of her broken heart. I want you to remember that your father's last words were about taking care of me. Not financially. Any stranger could do that. But taking care of my heart, my spirit, my place in this family. She paused at the bottom of the staircase, not turning around. And I want you to remember that when your son grows up and has to choose between his wife and his parents, the example you're setting today is the one he'll follow tomorrow. That night, as the house slept, Kamala packed her belongings into the same old trunk that had carried her dreams from one life to another. She wasn't running away. She was running toward the woman she used to be. The one who had never asked for anyone's permission to exist with dignity. By morning, the only trace of her presence was a note on the kitchen table. Thank you for letting me know where I stand. Now let me show you where I choose to sit. The mother they had called useless was about to prove them magnificently wrong. The small rented room on the outskirts of the city wasn't much to look at. A single window facing a narrow alley, walls that had seen better decades, and a loneliness that seemed to echo with every footstep. But for the first time in years, Kamala felt something she had almost forgotten: freedom. No one here called her useless. No one here made her feel like her very existence was an inconvenience. The silence was her own, and in that silence, she began to remember who she had been before she became somebody's burden. The old Singer sewing machine, the same one that had seen her through her darkest days as a young widow, sat in the corner like a faithful friend waiting to be awakened. Kamala ran her fingers over its familiar surface, feeling the muscle memory return to her hands. Let's see if we still remember how to fight, she whispered to the machine and to herself. The first week was the hardest. Her fingers, soft from years of relative comfort, struggled with the needle. Her back ached from hunching over fabric for hours. But with each passing day, something beautiful began to happen. The woman who had been disappearing slowly started to emerge again. She began with simple alterations for her neighbors. Mrs. Gupta's blouse that needed taking in. Young Kavya's kurta that was too long. Word spread quietly through the cramped lanes of the neighborhood about the gentle lady in room 204, who could work magic with cloth and thread. Auntie, you're an artist, Kavya said, twirling in her perfectly fitted kurta. Where did you learn to sew like this? Life was my teacher, Beta, Kamala smiled. And necessity was my motivation. But it was Meera Devi, the owner of a small boutique in the local market, who changed everything. She arrived at Kamala's door one evening with a proposition that would have seemed impossible just months before. I've heard about your work, Meera said, examining the intricate embroidery on a blouse Kamala had just completed. This is exceptional. Where have you been hiding this talent? Kamala almost laughed at the question. Where had she been hiding it? In the kitchen, making endless meals for people who barely looked up to say thank you. In the living room, watching television shows she didn't enjoy because the remote was never offered to her. In her bedroom, making herself small and quiet so as not to disturb the real family downstairs. I haven't been hiding it, she said simply. I just forgot I had it. Meera's proposal was straightforward. A partnership. Kamala would create exclusive pieces for the boutique, traditional wear with contemporary touches that would appeal to the growing market of young women who wanted to honor their heritage while expressing their individuality. I can't pay you a huge salary up front, Meera admitted, but I can offer you 40% of whatever we earn from your designs. And Kamala ji, I have a feeling we're going to earn a lot. That night, Kamala sat by her small window, looking at the contract Mira had left with her. 40% of her own work, her own creativity, her own worth measured not by someone else's convenience, but by the beauty she could bring into the world. She thought of Arjun, probably coming home to a dinner he didn't appreciate, served by a wife who saw cooking as a chore rather than an act of love. She thought of little Rohan, growing up in a house where the elders were treated as expired warranties rather than repositories of wisdom. She thought of Priya, who was so focused on creating her perfect modern life that she had forgotten life's imperfections were often its greatest gifts. And for the first time since that terrible dinner, Kamala felt sorry for them instead of herself. The partnership with Mira blossomed beyond either of their expectations. Kamala's designs, elegant salwar suits with hand-embroidered borders, saris that told stories through their patterns, lehengas that made young women feel like queens, became the talk of the neighborhood, then the district, then the city. Kamala Creations wasn't just a brand. It became a symbol of what happened when experience met opportunity, when wisdom was allowed to wear its crown instead of being hidden in the shadows. 6 months after leaving her son's house, Kamala received her first major order, 50 pieces for a wedding exhibition in the city center. The payment alone was more than she had ever dreamed of earning, but more importantly, it was payment for being valued, not just accommodated. She was putting the finishing touches on a particularly intricate bridal lehenga when her phone rang. The number was familiar, too familiar. Ma. Arjun's voice sounded strained, tired in a way that had nothing to do with work. Ma, we need to talk. Through the phone, she could hear the distress in his silence, the weight of problems she was no longer required to solve. Part of her wanted to ask what was wrong, to slip back into the role of the mother who fixed everything for everyone. But a larger part of her, the part that had learned to value her own peace, simply waited. My business is. There have been some complications. Bad investments. Ma, I think we might lose the house. The irony was almost poetic. The same house where she had been made to feel like a financial burden was now the burden that was drowning them. The same daughter-in-law who had called her useless was the one whose financial advice had led them to this crisis. I'm sorry to hear that, Beta, Kamala said, and she genuinely was. She took no pleasure in their struggles, found no satisfaction in their downfall. Ma, we were wondering if. His voice broke slightly. Could we come see you? We need help and I know we don't deserve it, but you're still my mother, and I don't know who else to turn to. Kamala looked around her small room, at the sewing machine humming with purpose, at the orders piling up from customers who respected her talent, at the life she had built from nothing but determination and thread. She thought about the woman who had left this house in shame, and the woman who now had the power to help or refuse. Yes, she said simply. You can come see me. But Arjun, when you come, don't come as people who need something from me. Come as people who want to understand what you lost when you decided I was worthless. After she hung up, Kamala returned to her embroidery, her needle moving with the steady rhythm of a heart that had learned to beat for itself again. Tomorrow would bring difficult conversations and painful truths, but tonight belonged to her. To the woman who had discovered that being discarded by others was sometimes exactly what you needed to find your own treasure. The tables weren't just turning. They were being rebuilt entirely, with her hands holding the tools this time. They came on a Sunday morning, looking smaller somehow than Kamala remembered. Arjun's confident posture had been replaced by the hunched shoulders of a man carrying invisible weight. Priya, usually immaculate in her designer clothes and perfect makeup, appeared tired and worn, her expensive handbag clutched defensively against her chest. But it was little Rohan who broke Kamala's heart. The boy looked confused and scared, his small hand gripping his father's with the desperation of a child who sensed his world was falling apart, but couldn't understand why. Daddy! Rohan broke free and ran to her, wrapping his thin arms around her waist with the pure love that only children possess. In that moment, Kamala remembered why forgiveness existed, not for the people who hurt us, but for the innocent hearts caught in the crossfire of adult failures. Hello, my prince, she whispered, stroking his hair. I've missed you so much. Over simple tea and homemade biscuits, luxuries that felt foreign to them now, Arjun told her the story of their downfall, the business venture Priya had insisted on, the loans taken against the house, the friends who had disappeared when the money ran out. Each detail was a small humiliation. Each confession a step away from the pride that had once made them feel superior to her simple lifestyle. "We lost everything, Ma," Arjun said quietly. "The house, the car, most of our savings. We're staying in a small flat now, and even that." He couldn't finish the sentence. Kamala listened without judgment, though part of her wondered if they could hear the irony in their own words. The same son who had watched silently as his wife called her useless was now sitting in her modest room, asking for help from the woman they had discarded. "What do you need from me?" she asked simply. It was Priya who answered, and her voice carried a humility that Kamala had never heard before. "We need money, Ma. Just enough to get back on our feet. A loan will pay you back, I promise." Kamala nodded slowly. "I can help you financially. I've been blessed with more success than I expected." She paused, watching their faces flood with relief. "But money isn't the real problem here, is it?" The silence stretched uncomfortably. Rohan played quietly with his biscuit, unaware of the weight of the conversation happening around him. "Ma, I know we made mistakes," Arjun began. "No," Kamala interrupted gently. "You made choices. And choices have consequences, Beta. The question now is whether you understand what those choices cost you. And I don't mean money." She stood up and walked to her small kitchen, returning with a notebook, the same one she had shown Arjun months ago. "Do you remember this?" Arjun nodded, his eyes downcast. "Every sacrifice in this book was made with love. Every rupee saved, every comfort given up, every dream deferred. It was all done because I believed that family meant putting each other first." She set the notebook down between them. "But family isn't just about sacrifice, Beta. It's about respect. It's about dignity. It's about making each other feel valued, not tolerated." Priya's perfectly composed mask finally cracked. Tears began streaming down her face. Not the manipulative tears of someone trying to get their way, but the genuine tears of someone finally understanding the depth of their own cruelty. "Ma, I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I was wrong. I was so wrong about everything. I thought I was building a better life for us, but I destroyed the most important thing we had." For the first time since they had arrived, Kamala saw something real in her daughter-in-law's eyes. Not calculation, not convenience, but genuine remorse. "I called you useless," Priya continued, her voice breaking. "But you're the strongest person I know. You built a life from nothing twice. While I was busy looking down on you, you were showing me what real strength looks like." Kamala reached across and took Priya's hand. "Beta, I was never angry with you for wanting a modern life. I was hurt because you thought respecting your elders was incompatible with progress. Love doesn't become old-fashioned just because the world changes. Can you forgive us?" Arjun asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Can we try again?" Kamala looked at her son, really looked at him, and saw not the successful engineer who had outgrown his mother, but the scared little boy who used to climb into her bed during thunderstorms. "Of course I forgive you," she said simply. "But forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting, and it's not the same as going back to the way things were. If we're going to be a family again, it has to be built on respect, not just need." She opened her purse and wrote out a check, enough to cover their debts and give them a fresh start. But as she handed it to Arjun, she held his gaze steadily. "This money comes with one condition. You use this chance to build not just financial security, but character. You teach your son that elders are not burdens to be managed, but treasures to be cherished. And you remember that the day you stopped seeing me as useful was the day you stopped seeing me at all." The family that left her small room that day was different from the one that had arrived. Humbled, grateful, and perhaps, finally, ready to understand that true wealth had nothing to do with money and everything to do with how we treat the people who love us most. 6 months later, Kamala stood in the garden of a new house. Not the grand mansion Arjun had once promised her, but something far more precious. A home built on mutual respect rather than obligation. The small 2-bedroom house had been purchased with the combined income of Arjun's rebuilt consultancy and Kamala's thriving design business. But more importantly, it had been chosen together as a family. The evening air carried the scent of the jasmine flowers she had planted with Rohan's eager help. At 12, her grandson had become her most devoted assistant, learning not just how to tend plants but how to tend relationships with the same patience and care. Dottie, tell me again about the time you started your business, Rohan said, settling beside her on the small garden bench they had built together. Which part, Beta? The scary part or the exciting part? Both, he laughed, his eyes bright with the curiosity that reminded her so much of his father at that age. As she told him their story, Kamala marveled at how much had changed. Arjun worked hard to rebuild not just his career but his relationship with her, asking for her advice on decisions both big and small. Priya had become a different person entirely, treating Kamala not as a relic of the past, but as a mentor for navigating life's challenges with grace. But perhaps the most beautiful change was in the way they spoke to each other. Conversations that had once been reduced to perfunctory exchanges about meals and weather now ranged from Rohan's dreams of becoming an engineer like his father to Priya's growing interest in sustainable fashion inspired by Kamala's traditional techniques. Dottie, Rohan said thoughtfully, when I grow up and get married, I'll make sure my wife respects you too. Kamala smiled, pulling him closer. Beta, by the time you grow up, I hope you'll understand that respect isn't something you can make someone give. It's something you earn by showing it first. When you treat your elders with dignity, your children learn to do the same. Is that why Mama and Papa are different now? They're not different, my prince. They just remembered who they really are underneath all the noise of trying to impress the world. As the stars emerged in the darkening sky, Kamala reflected on the journey that had brought them here. The humiliation at that dinner table felt like another lifetime now, but she was grateful for it. Sometimes we need to lose our place in someone else's story to find our role in our own. Her phone buzzed with another order for Kamala Creations, a young bride in Delhi who had heard about the designer who created clothes that told stories of love and resilience. At 71, Kamala was busier and more fulfilled than she had ever been. But as she watched Arjun and Priya laugh together while preparing dinner, as she listened to Rohan practice the tabla she had bought him, as she breathed in the peace of a home built on equality rather than hierarchy, she knew the real success wasn't in the business she had built. It was in the family she had saved, by first saving herself. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give your loved ones is teaching them that your presence is a blessing, not a burden, and that lesson begins with believing it yourself.